Mixed tenure housing. Mixed tenure housing can be a very boring subject, particularly when you work for the private sector and private developers. And this is why I'm not going to start with mixed tenure housing. I'm going to start with the beginning, which is where I come from. I started my career doing entertainment, building entertainment buildings. Entertainment being nightclubs and restaurants, things that are very futile. And those were very temporary buildings. They were buildings that were programmed to exist only 5 years, 5 to 10 years. So it's a very strange thing because it's like telling a pregnant woman you're gonna have a kid, but the kid is gonna live only 5 to 10 years. So it instaurs a very particular relationship with temporality, one that is very much in contradiction with our practice as architects, because we are, in a way, we're still very much in the Stone Age. We're one of the last practices that is still imprisoned in the Stone Age. So the fate of non-permanence or best before is the title of one of the chapters of a book that's going to be in a bookstore near you very soon, hopefully. So I'm going to start with that so that you understand where I come from. But this is not working. Oh, okay. Okay, so I started my career building entertainment buildings. This is the first project I ever built, and it's still to this date, 16, 17 years later, the most published project of anything I've built. Strangely, I've either become very dumb or there's something wrong. This is a time where I used to draw my projects. I was working on my own. I'm not going to elaborate too much on this project, except that I want you to know that this is a project I had complete control of. I've designed everything. I've drawn everything down to the last little line. I've drawn the stools of the bar, the furniture, the ashtrays, literally everything. And at the time, I was accused by the architecture community and the critics of being a gadgetist. That was the first critique. See, because this building had a roof that opened, it retracted, and it works. It works because this roof has been opening and closing I don't know how many times every night for the last 16, 17 years. By the way, this building was supposed to be scraped off in 2003, and it's still up. So now it's 16, 17 years old. It's lasted way beyond the very short temporal period it was supposed to be. And if you look at this building as a professional, you will see that everything is wrong in it in terms of the standards of the industry. It's all wrong. Yet it turns out the contractors were wrong, and I was right, because everything that was non-standard in this building survived 15, 16, 17 years, is still kicking. See, this is a recent photo. The roof still works. People still dance. This is not as futile as it seems, because this was a very, very difficult project. It was built on a refugee camp. So how do you build a nightclub on a refugee camp? It costs you, these are the mirrors that reflect what is inside to the outside, so that the parking lot becomes part of the project, part of the club, and the car becomes part of the club. And it gives you, it's amazing how materials can work for you. Plexiglass, very poorly fixed on panels, start to ondulate and create this very interesting animated frame. So those are recent photos of it. It's completely rusted, but it still works. Everything that was standard from the building industry leaked water, so the building industry was wrong. And my artisans I worked with were right. So it's a very rough building. I love materials when they're rough and they're honest. These are my chairs, 16, 17 years later, unrestored. They're still used and abused, and I think they look better today than they did 17 years ago when they were polished and clean. After B18, my first nightclub, I became known for becoming an entertainer architect. So this is another project. It's called La Centrale, where I was supposed to recuperate a historical building. History for the historical people is limited to conserving the facade, which is, I think, a very dangerous simplification of history. So we got it out the building because we were allowed to put an animal inside that had nothing to do with the initial animal, except that we had to keep the skin very clean and polished and make it look like the postcard it supposedly was. So the animal I put inside was another one of those entertainment venues, except that we tried to do it very, very seriously. There was a table in the middle, inside of which were trapped the waiters. So the waiters were prisoners of the table. Their only escape was the hole that brought them down to the kitchen downstairs. and the people seated were seated 40 centimeters higher so that they can overlook the waiters, and their eyes were always higher than the waiters, and the waiters never shared the space. So you can understand this was no longer a restaurant. This was about really perverting the initial program, because a restaurant is a restaurant, and if you don't take it seriously, it's a very dumb program. It becomes decor and stupid and trendy and cute, and this is not what we like to do. But back to temporality, in this project we worked on, you can feel the issue of temporality coming back to me. Instead of cleaning back the facade and replastering it, we let it rot, and I call this the poetry of decay. And to further enhance this issue of temporality, I kept the temporary beams part of the facade. This made the facade, and I've encased the facade in wire mesh. This is not tenure housing. I'm still not talking about the project I'm here to talk about. See? And of course, another label was the retractable roofs. So I had 2 stars, entertainment architect and convertible roof architect. Gadgetist. Architecture critics don't like that, so don't give me an award because I'm a gadgetist. Inside was a big table around this, which people were seated, and the waiters were trapped inside, running like rats. This is the hall coming up into the space, and then the bar upstairs, which was majestically placed because the bar is a very important space. I love bars, and the bar still operates. These 2 buildings are still alive and still kicking, and they went way beyond their predicted lifespan. Okay, then there was an important shift, and we're beginning to get closer to the subject why I was invited here to talk, which is this issue of permanence. So I shift from the temporary buildings to the permanent buildings. And this was a very sour and extremely difficult shift. This project I'm going to talk about is extremely central and very important in my career, because I moved from complete control, designing what I like to call in French des dispositifs. For those who understand French, it translates pretty bad in English, apparatuses or tools or whatever, or instruments. And this is how I like to describe my works. Instruments that are really the result of a very controlled narrative or very controlled scenario. They respond to a very strict logic and total control, because as I told you earlier, in these first 2 projects, not only did I not buy anything from the construction industry, but I was in total control of the building, the finishes, the profiles of the windows, the ashtrays, the chairs, the lamps. Everything was designed and built by us to respond to a very strict and very extremely precise logic, which had to do with perverting the initial program. Now, how do you move from that after you're labeled as the bad boy who dances on graves and can only design places in which you go dance and drink and so on and so forth, and you build residential buildings in which people are going to raise their kids? You can understand that after these 2 projects and a series of temporary projects, my first 6 built projects were temporary projects. People or developers who build reasonable spaces would ban me from the industry because I was a dangerous architect, one that would not give the responsibility to design a space in which families are going to raise their kids. So working in permanence comes with very sour realities, with developers who tell you you have to be as subdued as possible, you have to do consensual architecture that can please everyone so we can sell it. This is not a temporary moment. This is not just a party, people coming in for a few hours, getting drunk and trashed and leaving your space. This is about people occupying these spaces for very long term. This is serious architecture. So it's very sour and very difficult to move from where I was to the seriousness of our practice. So I decided to take this very difficult exercise and make it even more difficult. And I decided not to design anything, in fact, not to draw. What do we do as architects? We draw the envelope of our building. So we make models. We draw the morphology of the building. Which I did not do in this case. I decided to refrain from the act of drawing. I occupied the maximum allowable envelope on this site down to the last cubic square meter. And this designed the envelope of the building. After that, my client told me I'm going to do a shell and core development. Shell and core development means shut up. You should not leave any traces of your architecture in this development, because there are more sensitive people, the interior architects of the future tenants, because we're catering for the high-end residential sector, people who have the means to come in with their own architects. So they don't want the shit you leave behind. They're going to go in and do their own thing. So you as the architect should leave no traces of your passage, which is exactly what I did. I took the term in the jargon we use in the professional jargon, shell and core means the shell and the core. I designed the shell, which I didn't design because it responded to very strict laws, and the core, which is the circulation, leaving absolutely no trace of my passage, meaning no trace of the structure, absolutely nothing, but the shell and the core, leaving a complete open plan for the future architects and becoming completely neutral. So I recap. I did not draw the envelope. I did not draw the plans. Not only that, by the time the wise 7 architects who did the 7 different apartments walked in, they called me one after the other asking me for elevations, which I refused to draw because I asked the interior architects to do their own interior elevations and I projected them to the outside, which you see in the background. Strangely, these 2 buildings are next to each other. This is Central, the restaurant I showed you, which is part of my early works, and very close to it was N.B.K, which was my first permanent building. So I recap. When I moved from temporary, where I have absolute control, to permanence, I voluntarily give up all my weapons. And I submit everything, so I don't draw the envelope, I don't draw the plans, I don't draw the elevations. Yet it gives you a very organic building. The reason why the buildings, the windows are not aligned is not because I was trying to be cute or trendy or whatever, but it's because they grew organically according to the different plans that were developed inside. So, and this is it at the far end to the right, facing the Beirut city center with the beautiful red tiled roofs, fantastic postcard. I don't like it. So, the austerity of prevailing dwelling typologies. You have to understand that moving into the permanence and moving into the residential sector was not giving up on the political issues that were very dear to me, that you find now in a completely different playground, which is fighting the developers and the prevailing typologies that for the last 40 years were fed to us and forced upon us. Any single building in Beirut, and in fact in the cities around Beirut and in our region, complies to this rule, which is catastrophic. Central blind cores, very deep slabs, non-porous envelopes, blind corridors, poorly ventilated space, poorly lit space. You get out of the elevator at noon on the 15th of August, you have to turn on the lights to put the keys into the door. Very, very strange. And the developers and lazy collaborate architects who worked with them have fed us this shit. Literally 100% of everything that was built for the last 40 years complies with these rules. Very bad interpretations of the modernist movements. So this was what I was faced with, and that I've started a combat against. And you understand where I come from. The way we used to live in the Mediterranean, most of you are Italians, you understand, is a very different relationship with the outside. There's the Liwan, which is a very typical typologies around which different rooms feed. Let's not go too far back in history, but in the present, you still see a lot of remnants of that in the fabric of our cities, where passages are very not clearly it's not clearly public or private space. You can sometimes walk through your neighbor's terrace in order to get to your apartment. So there's no clear limit between what's inside and outside, and it creates a completely different kind of social behavior than the crap we've been fed by the developers in the last 40 years. And I think not by a nostalgic act, that there's a lot to learn and to bring back from that. So this is what I've started doing in my act of resistance against the developers. And strangely now, a few years later, I have a hard time believing that I've become an architect that developers like, because what I do sells, and it sells quite well. Here, for instance, you can see the parents can wake up in their bedrooms, go down on the staircase, walk around the olive tree. Siam can be romantic. Go into the kitchen, grab a cup of coffee, go to the living room, take the newspaper, and go back down to their kids' rooms without ever walking inside. So every single room in the plan is connected to any other livable room in the plan without ever walking inside if you felt like it. And this is what draws the facade. End of story. And it becomes very clear in the plans, and this is what articulates the facade. No funny shapes, no tweaks, no angles, none of that. And there's a lot of that in my projects. We're not going to go through all of them, but this is also another clear example where with a very odd plot, which has only 14 meters of width on the street and 55 meters of depth, we basically snaked around the site and drew a parcours which ties all the rooms together and hugs the site by creating an internal courtyard through split sections. So those are photos of this building, which takes on funny shapes, but the shapes are not funny just to be funny. They're about really the parcours and the journeys from one room to the other, again, hugging the building from the outside. So reconnecting to the outside. This is one of my latest monsters. It looks like a monster, but it's not a mean building. It's in fact a very sensitive building. What's particular about this building is that the periphery of the site is about 400 meters, only 6 meters of which face public property, meaning the remaining 390 meters or so are facing hostile peripheries where a neighbor can come in and build a blind wall that can go up to 50 meters. And what I've done here is literally took the odd shapes of the site and offsetted it all the way up by setting back in order to give legal light and legal air to all the periphery. So I did not draw the envelope once more. I literally translated setback laws, but by doing that, I made a very, very sensitive gesture so that the future neighbors will not have a blind wall in front of them, and maybe they will be polite like me. So be aware of appearances. If it looks weird and violent, it is not. This is in fact a very sensitive gesture. We're at this point surrounded by agricultural land, and very, very soon, as Beirut is moving very, very quickly in the absence of any master plan, catastrophes can happen around us. How do you work around and how do you predict these catastrophes? And it turns out that it gives you very, very interesting plans inside and a very interesting relationship to the outside. This is probably the closer example of my residential developments that tie back to my early years of entertainment. This is a building you can walk and drive through, not only walk through, take your car or motorcycle and go up and park it into your living room, into what is relatively small spaces. I think this is more an entertainment project than this is the fantastic elevator that takes you up and down, and this is me riding the bike into an apartment. So Beirut is a very catastrophic city that is growing in the absence of any master plan, and this is where I live right now. And you can see these sort of solitary developments where buildings go up with absolutely no respect to what is around them, and it keeps happening and keeps densifying more and more in the complete absence of any regulating master plan, which is in fact the result of the complete bankruptcy of the notion of state, the complete bankruptcy of the state itself. So this is where I live, and what I'm going to show you, and the reason why I'm here, is to show you my house. It's very odd. I chose to settle on this site for very specific, very particular reasons. It's because all around me are remnants of the mandates, institutional buildings, which is very, very rare in Beirut, the Maronite Cemetery, a stadium, the French Faculty of Medicine, the French Embassy, and so on. So all around me, in the foreground, are low-rise controlled developments that are institutional, which is very rare in Beirut. But this gives me the setback to look at the hell of the city, which is in the foreground. And I decided to settle there because it's neither in East Beirut nor in West Beirut. It's smack in the center of the hell of Beirut, and it's either that or go choose the romantic Mediterranean posture, which is turn your back to the city and look at the sea, which I find very, very uninteresting. If you want to be in Beirut, you got to be there. So this is where I choose to settle, and again I respond to a developer's offer. And right before I start, the top thing you see on top of this building to the right with the two cannons is my house. I reserved the last 8 meters of the development on which I planted a house, under which there's a building which I've designed myself. So you can see in the foreground all the institutional buildings, and in the background the extreme density. My house is what you see up there. We're looking at it from the French Embassy here on Damascus Road, and as you get closer, you see that in fact I live in a window, in a frame that establishes a very carnal relationship between me and the city, which is also the result of and the will to engage with the city in the most direct and the most intense possible way. I also gave myself another gadget here. It's a futile gadget. It's probably the highest, certainly the highest pedestrian bridge overlooking the streets of Beirut, and it crosses my frame smack in the middle of my living room. And this thing you see to the right is the machine that cools and ventilates my space. So that's the frame, it's my dining room, and this is my roof terrace, which we'll look at in a second. We'll skip the drawings. And one last very important point I'd like to talk about is reconnecting with artisans. And for this particular project, where I'm not working with a developer, I'm working for my own, it's my own house. I reconnected with people that are very dear to me, to start with the carpenter, who was the apprentice of he's now in his late 70s. He was the apprentice of my grandfather, who was an ebonist. I'm somebody who loves to work with his hands. I'm somebody who's very fiercely fighting the standards of the industry, the profiles, image profiles that we import from China, the Anglo-Saxon codes of conduct when it comes to being green, which is very boring and that I don't care about. To me, it's very important to protect these last survivors, these last artisans that are disappearing from the face of our profession. So the carpenter was very central. He kept yelling at me for months during construction, telling me, this is how you do this is how you do that. I can take that from a carpenter, but I can't take that from a developer. I also worked with another great man who's very old, who spent over 50 years of his life molding cornices in white plaster. And here he's built the cover of my machine, which was very carefully engineered by my mechanical engineers, which is the apparatus or the machine that cools and ventilates the central window, the central living space. It's done in plaster. So I completely perverted this guy's material, which was white plaster, used usually that you associate to classical architecture. Here is used to cover machines, a very complex machine. And sacrilege, it was painted in black polyurethane. And he went crazy when I told him we had to paint it in black polyurethane. The steelworks, which allowed me to reconnect with traditions that my father left me. My father was an architect and a modernist, a hardcore modernist, or the likes of the masters such as Scarpa and whatever, the good ones. So working with bolts very carefully, reconnecting with these materials in the most honest way is very central. You see it in the way we connect the steps to the staircase. So I show you the nightclubs down to the doorknob and the light fixtures, the doorknob that I refused to buy from the industry, and the work of my master carpenter, who's built out of solid wood, fantastic strips that are connected with one single rod all across the section. The table that I've also designed and had built with him around the cannon, and my terrace, which allowed me a very decadent posture over Beirut. And last but not least, the two cannons, which are retractable, that when we installed them, the intelligence services or not so intelligent services of the army showed up to inspect them, to make sure it was not a military installation. And during our first co-owners meeting in the building, one of the tenants was really worried that Sahal, the Israeli artillery airplanes would bombard us, because in 2006 they did hit some water wells that looked like cannons. So if this happens, I will be a very famous martyr of architecture out of my futile gestures. Thank you very much.